It's the same when we study Revelation. This book is the revelation of Jesus. Some people have called it the fifth gospel. And each time we see a new vision, it recapitulates and expands on the themes developed in the earlier visions. It's like a great symphony. I put that in my email this week. It's like a great symphony that will build and expand to a great conclusion. And I saw this from Grant Osborne, and I just thought it was really good. The unity of Revelation is neither chronological nor arithmetical, but artistic, like that of a musical theme with variations, each variation adding something new to the significance of the whole composition. This is the only view which does adequate justice to the double fact that each new series of visions both recapitulates and develops the themes already stated in what has gone before. And I thought he just really captured that. Last week I put up symbols from Revelation 7. I put these together and put text to go with them. And once again, there'll be a lot of text you guys will see today. If you want my PowerPoint after this is over, just come up and give me your email. I'm happy to send it to you. But there's a number of things we'll be talking about today. The outer court of the sanctuary represents the earth. Incense, prayers of God's people. If you want to look at the texts that go with it, we have them. Throwing a censer is judgment action. Mountains are kingdoms, are empires. The sea is people opposed to God. Stars are angels. Rivers and streams are spiritual nourishment. Thunder, lightning, the appearance of God. You can see all the rest of them. It's up there so you can read it. But we'll be looking at each one of those today. One that I think is significant is wormwood. Bitterness through sin and apostasy. So we have those, and we have them that we can look back if we need to. As we studied earlier, Christ took and opened the six seals, representing the history of his church from the crucifixion to the second coming. The first seal unleashed a white horse, representing the pure era of the apostolic church. As the other seals are opened, the church is compromised more and more in each seal, to the point that by the sixth seal, the church is persecuting the true believers. This new episode that we're going to begin today portrays a series of trumpet soundings which foretell several events falling on the earth. John's question in Revelation 6:17, we answered last week, who can stand the wrath of God? As we studied, the faithful of God can stand when they wash their robes in the blood of Jesus. It was interesting last week, and it just stuck with me. The people that stood, that had the blood of Jesus, all glory was to God. There was nothing mentioned about what they did to earn it. It was all God. They washed, and that's what I want. I want that robe. It's not about us. It's about God. It's about who you trust. But now we begin Revelation 8. This chapter has only 13 verses, but they are packed. First, we come to the seventh seal. And who has Revelation 8, verse 1? Raise your hand. There you go.
When he opened the seventh seal, there was silence in heaven for about half an hour.
There it is. That's everything we know about the seventh seal. He opened the seventh seal, and there was silence in heaven for about a half an hour. Any ideas on what this seventh seal is? Anybody want to venture a guess on what this seventh seal is?
Instruction is about the time of Christ's second coming, the period of returning back to heaven. There's silence because there's nobody's there.
Interesting. So I do have another slide on that from the Great Controversy, page 640. The King of Kings, is Jesus coming back? There's silence in heaven because Jesus is coming back. The King of Kings descends upon the cloud wrapped in flaming fire. The heavens are rolled together as stone. The earth trembles before him, and every mountain and island is moved out of its place. And then in Psalms 53 and 4, our God shall come and shall not keep silent. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous all around him. He shall call to the heavens from above and to the earth that he may judge his people. So what about that half-hour silence? Any ideas on the half-hour silence? Seventh seal, half-hour silence. Anybody? Anybody want to venture? The truth is, we don't know. That's the truth of it. There have been many theories. Yes, well.
Oh, I was just gonna say, basically same thing you did. The Jews actually believed that the silence was because the Godhead was listening to the prayers before they were going to declare the judgment stuff. And silent for the half hour, that could be, interpreted within the day to a year prophecy, but it can also just mean a short period of time.
It could mean either one, correct? So the truth is, we don't know. There have been many theories. Some have said it mimics the silence at creation. Some have said that there is silence in anticipation of the judgment. Some have said it's the calm after the storm of the destruction by Christ's second coming. We aren't told, but we do know that it is symbolic. One of the theories that I like is what Wolf just mentioned, is the angels have all left for the earth to get the redeemed, so at that point, heaven would be empty. I have read that this time was not symbolic of the day-year theory. But if you look at prophetic time of a day equaling a year, there are 24 hours in a day, there are 48 half hours in a day. A half hour is approximately 7 days in prophetic time. So in that case, there's silence in heaven for approximately 7 days. Once again, this is all speculation. But could this possibly mean that it's going to take us, or we're going to spend 7 days going to heaven? Could it be that we would spend Sabbath on another inhabited planet with Jesus introducing us to other world's beings? How great would that be? It's speculation, but how great would that be? So today we're going to start looking at the 7 trumpets. We're going to look at the first 4 of the 7 trumpets. The completion of the opening of the 7th seal starts a new episode in John's vision. This new episode portrays a series of trumpet soundings which foretell several events falling on the earth. So what are these 7 trumpets all about? Anybody want to venture a guess on the 7 trumpets, what they're about? We're going to have a really short class today. Really short.
To wake up God's people.
To wake up God's people. Anybody else? Anybody else? Just venture a guess on what these 7 trumpets are all about.
They appear to be judgments.
They are judgments. They present God's judgments in the final conflict. Anybody else? Because I think if we miss this, we miss something very important. Right over here, there's a hand. Jay.
Can I holler out?
Well, no, Jay's. You get what you pay for, right? Right down here.
I was just going to say that there seem to be 2 areas in the Old Testament in which trumpets figure predominantly, and that going to war or this sort of thing, battle cry, or worship, the calls to worship in the sanctuary service. There was a time when 7 trumpets blew. In that
Trumpets
order.
were very important in the Old
Yes,
Testament.
those were
Yes.
the main ones that I could see.
Yeah, so we're gonna look at that.
Warfare or worship.
Warfare, worship, we're gonna look at those in just a second.
And a call to assemble,
And a call to assemble, Mary said.
and a call of alarm and warning.
So I don't want, there's something I don't want us to miss in these 7 trumpets. Mark right back here. I don't want us to miss in these 7 trumpets because they are God's judgment, but there's something else in there.
Coronation of a new king.
Coronation of a new king is also the 7 trumpets. But this is God's last call. It's his last call. There's judgments, but there's still, he's saying, come to me, come to me. It's his last call to people to choose him here and then here. Yes.
I don't know what the correlation is here for sure, but looking at this, it looks like there's a little lot nodding to creation too. Ending with the kingdom of God being declared on the 7th day. That's all I have to say.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.
I see a correlation here between what happened in the Old Testament times early with the plagues. And I see this as a correlation to it in kind of bookends. 7 last plagues come to mind.
Yes.
And I love how there's another trumpet that's not up there, and it's the trumpet that's gonna wake everybody up, the dead in Christ.
Amen.
And I think of the song, Lift Up the Trumpet, loud let it ring. Jesus is coming.
The announcement,
The
right?
announcement,
The
and
king.
kind of a wake up, and something powerful about that. You know, today we use cell phones and different things to get a message across, but he is getting it through this.
So if the 7 trumpets, well, what is the time of the blowing of the 7 trumpets? Just in comparison to the 7 seals, what is the time? Anybody know what the time is of the 7 trumpets? After Jesus' death. If the 7 churches and if in the 7 churches and the 7 seals, we always begin with the time or where a prophet is, we should expect this first trumpet to blow when and where John was, in the days of Christ and John. We would also expect that these 7 trumpets represent the 7 of God's different judgments from the 1st century to the last century. So when we looked at the 7 seals, and I'll show you this in a minute, but we looked at the 7 seals, they went from Jesus' crucifixion to the end of time. 7 trumpets, Jesus' crucifixion to the end of time. They're right on top of each other.
I was gonna take a stab too at the big picture. When we're thinking about the churches and the seals, they each went up back to a period of time, right? And that's what you're asking here, the period of time. So looking at the 7 trumpets, it appears to me that it could be going back to answer that question, how long? How long are you going to put up with this before something happens? And when we look at the 7 trumpets, it's almost a recap. He's answering that by saying, well, I hear you.
I hear you. Yep.
But by the way, each time there's been persecution, there have been judgments. Let me just recap it for you. Is that part of this big picture?
And like what we said earlier, recap and add on to. It's like the 7 churches were there, then the 7 seals added to that. Now the 7 trumpets are going to recap and add to that. The 7 trumpets are arranged the same way the 7 seals are into groups of 4 and 3. The first 4 trumpets differ from the last 3 in form and weight, and today we're going to look at the first 4. To better understand the trumpets, we touched on this earlier. I think it would help to see how they were used in the Bible. Blowing trumpets was a well-known concept in the Old Testament. So when the people are looking at what John is writing, they're understanding it because trumpets played a major part in their life. The life of Israel as a nation was ordered by trumpet blast. In both the Old and New Testament, trumpets symbolize God's intervention in history. The life of Israel was closely associated with the blowing of the trumpets. Shofar trumpets made of ram's horns were the most frequently mentioned instruments in the Old Testament. They were used as a signaling instrument to make noise rather than music. And they were blown for several reasons, as Joan was saying. And we have a look at that in Numbers back in the Old Testament. Revelation goes back to the Old Testament over and over again. But tells them how they blow the trumpets. When you go to war against the enemy who oppresses you, then you should sound the alarm with the trumpets. You will be remembered before the Lord your God and will be saved from your enemies. Also in the day of gladness, in your appointed feast, at the beginning of your months, you shall blow trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be a memorial for you before God. I am the Lord your God. And to what Mary said, lift up the trumpet and loud let it ring. He's announcing it. That's his memorial. So the blowing of the trumpets symbolizes intervention of God in history. A summon to battle, coronation of a king, calling of the people together, a warning of danger. In most cases, trumpets were used in the context of temple, liturgy, or holy wars. So with that background, who has Revelation 8, 2 through 6?
Saw the seven angels which stood before God, who had given seven trumpets. Another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and they were given unto him much incense, offered the prayers of all the saints on the golden altar. The smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God and out of the angel's hand. The angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. There were voices, thunderings, and lightnings in the earthquake. The seven angels which had the seven trumpets prepared themselves to sound.
So this is the introduction to the blowing of the trumpets. Seven angels, picture it. Seven angels are standing before God's throne to receive seven trumpets. Their mission is to announce a series of woes on the earth. Then in verses 3 through 5, there's a literary feature used many times in Revelation where something is being explained and then a detour is made. John used it last week when we were going through the seals. As we studied between the sixth and seventh seal, he stopped and said, who's going to be able to stand? And he spent a whole chapter saying who's going to be able to stand and why. Same thing happens in verses 3 through 5. A detour was made. Before the angels blow their trumpets, an unspecified angel appears holding a golden censer. He stands at the altar of sacrifice, which is in the outer court. Another thing it's fascinating to me about Revelation, it all happens in the sanctuary when we're looking at heaven. It's all in the sanctuary. So what do you make of this scene? Anybody have any thoughts on it? Verses 3 through 5 show a scene that took place daily in the earthly sanctuary. The lamb was slain on the altar. We just read something about it earlier. The lamb was slain on the altar and the blood was poured out. It happened daily in the earthly sanctuary. Incense representing the prayers of his people were taken into the holy place in the temple. After that was over, the priest came out of the temple and threw a censer on the pavement. After that, 7 trumpets were sounded. Before the angels blow their trumpets, John sees a new symbolic scene. This scene is built on the daily temple practices. So how about the angel with the golden censer? What do you make of this angel?
So Bob, I don't need the microphone. I just was trying to understand.
We do need the microphone
Yeah,
for you,
no.
Mary. Oh, yes, here you are, it's there.
I just have a question. I'm just trying to figure this thing out in my mind. This other angel that comes, so everything so far kind of adds up to what we've seen in the past, except for when that angel hurls it to the earth. Is that the different thing that's happened? So that's the different thing. Everything is kind of, we've done this before. This is what we usually do.
And
The thing
actually,
that-
a person in the earthly sanctuary came out with a censer and threw it to the earth.
Yeah.
I mean, threw it to the ground, and then the trumpets blasted.
Okay, but the thing that's different this time is that it's hurled to the earth,
Yes,
right? Okay.
yes.
I'm just clarifying in my little muddled mind here, that's all. I'm not making a point, just
No,
trying to clarify.
I understand, yes.
Just a little correction. The going into the most holy place and the throwing of the censer down only took place once a year at Kippur,
You are correct.
rather than it being a daily thing.
Yeah.
Just wanted to correct that.
Yeah, you are correct. So how about that angel with the golden censer? What do you make of this angel? Anybody?
All right, I'm gonna go on a limb here. But to me, it's Jesus as our high priest going before the Father, saying, here's all my people sealed up, all their prayers, you know, they're yours, and I'm coming back. And this is him leaving that scene. It's just another symbol of his return.
Well, and also, he's going before the Father with the prayers of the saints. We go back to the 5th seal where they're saying, how long? The martyrs are going, how long? How long before there's vengeance? How long? And this is going right back to that. In the symbols of Revelation 8, we saw that the censer represented judgment. So this was also part of the services. The angel takes the censer, fills it with coals once a year from the altar, takes it into the holy place, offers it upon the golden altar. Having offered the incense, the priest would come out of the temple, throw the censer down on the pavement, producing a loud noise. As soon as that happened, the 7 angels blew their trumpets to end the daily and yearly services. And I had just asked, what do you make of that censer being thrown down to the earth? The censer is judgment, right? So in Ezekiel 10:2, Ezekiel's vision shows the act of hurling fiery coals upon the earth denotes judgment. At that time, it denoted judgment on Israel for their apostasy. So he said, go within the wheelwork under the cherubim, fill both your hands with burning coals around the cherubim, then scatter them over the city. So judgment over the city. It is especially significant since at the opening of the 5th seal, where the slain saints beneath the altar are praying for judgment for those who dwell on the earth. This censer to the earth is in answer to those prayers. Yes.
And it just kind of struck me of how Moses coming down from the mountain with the 10 Commandments was a similar act of judgment. He broke the 10 Commandments and he cast them down and broke them. So maybe there's a correlation there to some degree.
So much of this goes back to Israel. We're going to look at it. We look at these trumpets, a lot of them compare to the plagues. So when this is completed, the 7 angels are now ready to blow their trumpets. At each trumpet sound, a chain of events takes place on the earth. These chain of events should be understood as interventions of God in response to the prayers of his saints. Before we go to the first trumpet, I would like to take just a minute to compare the 7 trumpets and the 7 seals, and we'll go through this pretty quickly. The 7 seals are concerned with the progress of the preaching of the gospel and with those that reject it. The trumpets are the response to the suffering of his saints. Their plea, how long will you not judge? If the 7 seals designate the ongoing period in which God leads his people through the process of overcoming, we conclude that that period is from the cross to the second coming. The 7 trumpets represent the judgment of God on those who reject the gospel and oppose and persecute God's people. They also represent the period from the cross to the second coming. And you can see the comparison of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets. And they both seem to come together with the silence in heaven and the 7th trumpet, which is God coming back. Adventist eschatology puts the timing of the 7 seals and the 7 trumpets throughout the Christian era rather than just the time of the end. Both the 7 seals and 7 trumpets cover the same period. We've gone over that. The scene of the opening of the seals portrays the gospel. The vision of the blowing of the trumpets portrays the judgment of God on those who reject the gospel. But also in that blowing of the trumpets, there's still a chance for those who have rejected. It's his last plea. It's not just about judgment. It's redemptive. I think that's the last one for that. So who has Revelation 8, verse 7. And now we're at the first trumpet.
The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down on the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and the green grass was burned up.
Yes, Dennis. Dennis.
I just found it interesting reading this week, pulling up data of scientific studies, and has nothing to do with any Christian Adventist slant to it. But reading that they say they look at the last ice age ending about 10,000 years ago. And it was in bold statement that since that time, from then to now, that we have lost 1/3 of the Earth's forests. I just found that, kind of reading this and reading that, and they said that half of that happened from 10,000 BC to 1900. The other half has happened since 1900 to now. And you're looking at an area, they said probably about twice the size of the United States is what we've lost. But it was in bold and, really pointed out we have lost 1/3 of our forests.
How about that? So Revelation 8:7 is the first trumpet. If the judgments, as we said, begin in the 1st century, and if the prophecies are sequential and go down the span of time, that must mean that the first trumpet must blow sometime around the 1st century. And that trumpet brings hail and fire. Does that bring anything to mind in the Bible? Does that bring anything to mind? Sodom and Gomorrah. Anything else? Who said Jerusalem? Jerusalem, and how about anything else? Egypt. Linda, you said it earlier. The plagues. The plagues. Hail and fire was the 7th plague of Egypt. In the Old Testament, hail mixed with fire were God's weapon of judgment on those that oppose his people. And you can see that in Exodus 9:22-24. Stretch forth your hand, that there may be hail in all the land of Egypt, upon man and beast and every herb of the field throughout the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it since it became a nation. Hail and fire. The symbolism is that Egypt oppressed God's people, and God allowed judgments to come upon them. So that would mean sometime in the 1st century, God allowed judgments to come upon a group of people whose religious leaders rejected him.
Oh.
Yes?
That's what I was going to say.
Oh, did you have your hand up? Let her say it. She says it a lot better than me.
So then the judgment is actually against on those who were supposed to be God's people,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
The first trumpet,
Yes.
Jerusalem, Jews that rejected Christ, this sort of thing, right?
Yes.
And that's the judgment part of this first angel's
The first trumpet.
trumpet.
Yes.
The first
Yes.
trumpet.
Yes. So, did Jesus ever say anything? Let's see, I'm going ahead of myself. In the Old Testament, they were God's weapon of judgment. The symbolism is that did Jesus ever say anything about green trees and dry trees? Oh, I'm sorry. Mark, please.
So this actually reminds me of the fires that just happened in Maui. We've been there. That area is lush and green. And if somebody told me that's all going to be destroyed almost overnight, I would have said, no way. No, not there. And that's how quickly this happens with the trumpet, the destruction of fire.
Yes.
I think that's an interesting mix between hail and fire also. I mean, they probably would have welcomed hail in Maui. You know, when you see the two, that's an interesting mix.
Yes,
Hot
it
and
is.
cold, I don't know.
Yeah. Mary.
I was just gonna say, even though we're pinpointing when this occurred and this is judgment on Israel, I can see it being a judgment on us. When Jesus says in Matthew, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her." Well, how often do we do that same thing now? When we hear perhaps the word of God prick our own heart, oh no, that's not really me. Or if we hear somebody share something from Ellen G. White, she's a has-been, we need to wake up. Because just like they mentioned about Hawaii burning up, and I see some of this happening now, and Dennis saying the third of the world is being, the rainforest. Jesus goes on, how often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, for I say to you, you shall see me no more today. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so this trumpet, I think, is for us, even though I know it's been fulfilled, but I think it's for us too.
There's no doubt. The 7 churches, they're for us. The 7 seals, they're for us. The 7 trumpets, they're for us. It's the revelation of Jesus. Yes, yes.
I don't think I want to be around for this part. When I look at the first angel trumpet, it's not just hail. It's just not fire, and it's not just blood. It's hail mixed with fire, mixed with blood. And so I'm just kind of thinking, I never really looked at it that closely before, but I can't imagine even the slightest little hail, like half an inch, makes a huge noise. And this would be like nuclear war, wouldn't it? The destruction of it, the power.
And we're gonna take a look at it, how it actually happened on earth at one time. Did Jesus ever say anything about green trees and dry trees? Now we get a clue for understanding the first trumpet. A third of the trees were burned up. It's symbolic, but green grass and a third of the trees were burned up. Jesus gives a prophetic clue in something like a riddle. And here it is. But Jesus said to them, "Weep not for me, weep for yourselves and your children, because the days are coming in which they'll say, Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bear, and the paps which never gave suck. Then shall they begin to say, Fall to the mountains, fall on us, and to the hills. For if they do these things in a green tree, what shall be done in the dry?" If you say green trees are God's people, and dry is not, what shall be done in the dry? Trees and grass are used many times in the Old and New Testament to symbolize God's people. With this background, what do you think the first trumpet is? Joan, you said it. What do you think the first trumpet is?
Judgment at that time on the Jewish people, those who rejected Messiah.
It was judgment on God's Jewish people that rejected him. Biblical evidence leads us to conclude the first trumpet blast portrays the consequences upon his people who rejected and crucified Jesus. Both the leaders and the people were responsible. They all had access to the promises, however, most became opponents and persecutors. In the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, many of the Jews were burnt up. This remains not the worst, but one of the worst times in Jewish history. And that's the first trumpet. Anything else on the first trumpet? Any thoughts on it?
Just a little sidelight, as a builder, I was always intrigued by the fact that Christ said that with the temple in Jerusalem, that there would not be any stone left on top of another stone. And I used to wonder, so did the Romans actually sit there physically, tear these massive walls down, one stone after the other? I mean, why would they do that? Until I had a geologist one time, I was talking about that, and he said his theory is that with the marble that the temple was built with, and the fire that the Romans created inside that temple with all the wood and stuff, that you have a hot enough fire with marble, and you pour water on it, it actually will melt the marble. So the theory was, he said, I think, when it talks about fire and hail, there's usually rain that comes with hail. So once this thing was burning hot enough, very well could have been a hailstorm and a rainstorm that actually melted those stones to a place where not one stone was left upon another.
So, Revelation 8, verse 8 and 9, the second trumpet. Mary has that. Jay, you're strategically positioned.
So before I read that, I want to just comment on how you were mentioning Jesus referring to trees, like the fig tree and the olive tree and whatnot, for his people, and how scary this is with this judgment. But remember too, the verses in the Bible that say, I shall not be moved, just like a tree planted by the water. I shall not be moved. So if our roots go deep in Jesus, we're going to withstand this. So just to keep that in mind.
Yeah.
Okay, verse 8, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed.
What do mountains represent? Symbols. Anybody remember? Kingdoms. Kingdoms. So what do you think the great mountain of Revelation 8 has to do with? It has to do with the kingdom. Sorry?
Babylon.
Babylon. Babylon. And it's interesting that Paul and John both in the New Testament call Babylon Rome. What nation was it that put the nails in Jesus' hands? Who stood guard at the tomb of Jesus? Who put the seal on the tomb? During the period of from 100 to 313 AD, we see the rule of this great mountain, Rome. It seemed immovable. I mean, the Romans were powerful. But in 313 AD, there were tribes that came from the north and conquered them. The scene of the second trumpet is built on the description of the fall of ancient Babylon and the prophecy of Jeremiah. He predicted that God would judge Babylon, a destroying mountain, who destroys the whole earth for the evil they've done. Babylon is to be judged by God, a burning mountain that is thrown into the sea. Babylon was used in reference to the Roman Empire because it destroyed Jerusalem and the temple. It was to suffer its own fate. The second trumpet describes the downfall of Rome and the devastation of its social and economic order. I just said a bunch of things. I would like to take any thoughts or questions on it, but that is my view of the second trumpet from the Bible.
You touched on it. It was interesting in those days that the Jews, I mean, they totally understood this from their perspective, from their culture. In those days, the Jews would always refer to the Romans or Rome as Babylon, as, you know, the history of the oppression of the Jews from Babylon, rather than be critical of the Romans and bring criticism down upon themselves. They would just simply refer to the Romans as Babylon. So they totally understood the parallelism there.
Yeah. So the first two trumpets affect the Jewish and Roman empires. These two nations united in opposition to God and took part in the crucifixion of Christ. It started within the church and spread to those who joined in putting Jesus to death and oppressed and persecuted the church. So, any more on the second trumpet? Let's go to the third trumpet. Revelation 8, verse 10 and 11. Who has that?
Then the third angel sounded, and a great star fell from heaven, burning like a torch, and it fell on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters became wormwood, and many men died from the water because it was made bitter.
What do stars in the Bible symbolize? Angels. Since this star is referred to as great, it indicates we're dealing with a character which is actually superior or a higher order of angels. It reminds us of the star of the morning falling from heaven, and I will just show you two verses. Isaiah 14:12. How art thou fallen from heaven, O Lucifer, son of the morning? How art thou cut down to the ground, which did weaken the nations? And then from the New Testament, he replied, I saw Satan fall like lightning from heaven. So, from that, it's pretty clear that this great star was Satan. How about wormwood? How do you describe wormwood? What is it? Anybody?
It's a bitter.
It's a bitter herb, right? Bitter. and anything it touches will become bitter. You put it in food, you put it in water. This talks about wormwood going into water. And if you look at Deuteronomy 29, verse 17 and 18, it talks about wormwood. The bitterness of wormwood. And wormwood falls on the rivers and springs of water. So from our symbols, what do rivers and springs of water symbolize?
Spiritual nourishment.
Spiritual nourishment. So it falls, this bitterness falls upon spiritual nourishment and poisons the water, so to speak, poisons the water of the gospel. It's falling on the fresh waters and turns a third of them into wormwood or bitterness. Yes?
So could this possibly be how Christianity was being poisoned by wormwood during this time with the church, God's people, taking a turn to follow these Roman, the papal, what am I trying to say?
The
Don't say
secularism.
this. Yes, and the false truth and the corruption that's starting to enter into this that's supposed to be God's church. Now, mind you, he's got a remnant that's coming along always. There's always a remnant that's following the truth. But that started out, the Catholic Church started out as God's people to begin with. We see what happens to them as it becomes more and more corrupt.
The waters were
And
poisoned.
I'm thinking those good waters were being poisoned with human traditions and human whatever.
And what followed from that? What followed from the poisoning of that water? As we look back in persecution. Persecution followed. They poisoned the waters of the gospel, and persecution followed. You believe like this, or you die at the stake. You believe like this, or you are hunted and killed. Is there someone else? It falling on fresh water turns them into wormwood or bitterness. The sources of spiritual life are polluted by apostasy and false teaching, and the result was spiritual death. The falling of the star and the defiling of fresh water are symbols of apostasy and perverted truth. If the first two trumpets deal with the fall of the Jewish nation and Rome, then the third trumpet has to do with the period following the Roman Empire. And that period that followed the Roman Empire was known as the Dark or Middle Ages, when persecution was rampant. It's interesting that Jesus and Paul both predicted the apostasy that would be coming in the church. In Revelation 12 through 9, it talks about the dragon being thrown out of heaven and being cast to earth and his angels with him. Being cast out of heaven, Satan's great goal through all of this was to destroy Christianity. After the death of Christ and the apostles and the destruction of Jerusalem, Satan tried everything he could through the Roman Empire. Well, through first of all, through Israel, and then the Roman Empire to destroy Christianity. And the great mountain didn't succeed. So what did he do in the third trumpet? He changed his strategy. And I think he does that with us too. He changed his strategy, and now he tried to poison the gospel and bring in apostasy. You don't believe like me, you're going to die at the stake. That's the third trumpet. Are there any thoughts on the third trumpet?
I think we're still in the middle of it.
There's things we can think about for us in all of these, right? And I think the fourth trumpet, as we get to the fourth trumpet, there's a lot of lessons for us in this fourth trumpet. Who has Revelation 8, verse 12?
And the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun, and a third of the moon, and a third of the stars were stricken, so that a third of them became darkened, and the day did not bright for a third of it, and the night likewise.
So the fourth trumpet strikes the heavenly bodies. A third of the sun, moon, and stars became darkened. The day didn't brighten. Does this seem reminiscent of anything? The ninth plague, right? Darkness. The ninth plague in the Old Testament, the plague of darkness. Darkness in the Old Testament is a consistent symbol of judgment for sin. Light in the New Testament stands for the gospel. The fourth trumpet portrays the deepening of the prevailing darkness in the world. Feel like we're living in it right now? And the period that followed the Dark Ages. The fourth trumpet must be understood as describing the darkening of the spiritual forces of the true light, namely the Bible and gospel, under the prevailing influence of secularism. Feel like we're living there right now? The effect of the fourth trumpet plague is the partial darkness of the sources of spiritual light. I've kind of just walked through each of these trumpets because I want to get through before we. But are there any thoughts on that fourth trumpet? What do you think about that fourth trumpet? The effect of the fourth trumpet plague is the partial darkness of the sources of spiritual light. Any comments on the fourth trumpet? So these are the trumpets. The first trumpet is the destruction of Jerusalem. The second trumpet is when Rome was conquered. The third trumpet was the Dark Ages, where there was apostasy and persecution. And then the fourth trumpet was secularism. The first two trumpets are given in pairs. The first four trumpets are given in pairs. The first two deal with the Jewish nation and the Roman Empire. The second two deal with apostate Christianity and the consequences of that apostasy. These trumpets were intended primarily to be warnings that precede the woes of the remaining three trumpets. Yes?
Yes, when I see secularism, it reminds me of the French Revolution. And so we're looking at these big time periods that would kind of fit as the natural response to 1,200 years of papal rule and oppression. What do? You're going to throw off anything that has to do with the church. And so secularism would kind of be a logical response to what they put up with from church-oriented things. And so I just thought I'd mention that is what makes me think of in that time period is, okay, it's time for human reason. No more pushing of this religion on us.
Do we see that today? This fourth trumpet struck home to me. Yes.
Yeah, it struck home to me too. Yesterday, I happened to find myself at this store called The Loft. Anyway, they're having a great sale. My husband's gone, so anyhow.
We're going to charge the law.
Anyway, so the lady helping me, she said, I just want you to know that we now allow men who think they're women to come in these dressing rooms and try on female clothes. And I said, are you serious? And she said, yes. And I said, that is a tragedy. I might see myself as a tomato, but that doesn't mean I belong in the vegetables, So this is happening right here.
Is it a fruit or a
This is just horrible. I can't remember. Are tomatoes fruit? Yeah, well, whatever. Isn't this
It's actually a
horrible?
nightshade vegetable.
Oh, my word.
We have one back here, Ted. Very in the tomato section. I'm telling you, I will remember that one.
Okay, so let me just read this. This is 2 Thessalonians 2. The coming of the lawless one will be in accordance with the work of Satan, displayed in all kinds of counterfeit miracles, signs, and wonders, and in every sort of evil that deceives those who are perishing. They perish because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. For this reason, God sends them a powerful delusion so that they will believe the lie, and so that all will be condemned who have not believed the truth, but have delighted in wickedness. And that's what God is saying with the trumpets. You have a chance still. Don't believe the lie.
And once again, as we've studied all the way through Revelation, who do you trust? Who do you worship? It's about worship. Do you worship God? Do you worship Satan? Who do you worship and who do you trust? Yes.
Bobby, I don't know if I can summarize what I'm thinking because it's so complicated. I'll try.
That's the way I felt about this whole lesson.
So, I mean, starting from what was just said about current secularism, like right now, and the throwing off of all constraints during both the French Revolution and right now, many political and historians who I listen to are saying that this time in our society is much more radical and unstable than happened in the 60s, and much more so than happened in the 30s, and similar to what was happening in France in the late 1700s with the rise of the Jacobins and Robespierre and all that ridiculousness. And at the same time here, Jesus is speaking to John, and he's writing this somewhere in the first 100 years after Christ, right, somewhere. And so he's describing what's happening then and what's happening in the near future and what's happening in a somewhat distant future, which is kind of where we're living now. And it's very disturbing because what I'm seeing is if you try to express your understanding of the truth of Christianity and Christ's goodness, I mean, you think about it. If you try to explain the sacrificial system and the killing of animals and the spreading apart of their bodies and the burning of these things, it's just weird and gross, and to me, doesn't make sense. It's appalling, but that's actually what the end result of sin is in our world. It's appalling, and we're seeing it now in popular culture. It's just appalling, and I think, and it doesn't make sense to wash something in blood, right? I mean, if you want to take what's the worst possible thing you could get on something to stain, it would be blood, and gross too. And if you spill blood on yourself in a procedure or something medical, you better get some hydrogen peroxide to get that off of whatever it's on, or it's there for good. You know, you've ruined this thing. And it's just, I guess what I'm trying to say is a very poor synopsis or summary of this, but it blows me away, but it also, at the same time, validates and solidifies the teachings of Christ, and how difficult it is to talk to some people today, because if you say something that's against the popular culture, that a man could be a woman and a woman could be a man, and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera, it's when God said, and when he was creating things, that this is good, and then the next day, this is good, and then that was good. But what was very good was at the very end when men and women were made. And that symbolism of man and woman and sexuality and forming human relationships and families, and the pure blessing of that is being, what am I trying to say, destroyed, counterfeited today. I really appreciate this, what you're talking about. It's just not not a good way to summarize it, but it's just, those are some of the thoughts I came across. And the other thing was that a third of the forest, third of the oceans, third of the rivers, third of the angels, it's all extremely symbolic, and I don't begin to understand this. The extent of.
Here
No.
and then here.
No, what you just said is actually right on. Our call as Adventist people is not reformation. It is Babylon is fallen. Come out of her while you still have a chance. That's what Daniel, remember the story of the fall of Babylon with Daniel? The handwriting on the wall. Babylon is fallen. That's what we need to proclaim. And we need to get ready for his coming. That's our call.
I would just like to add to all these comments that these 4 trumpets, I think they are more than just circumstances. They're, as you mentioned, kind of like symbolism. They have deep symbolism to them. And as a theory, I believe these 4 trumpets are starting points. They are announcements God is giving us through John. These announcements are, I believe, positive for us because it's revelation. He's giving us extra information. However, the outcomes are not that positive. In fact, they are, I assume, I believe they are starting points in chronological order. We can see them in history, in universal history. However, I think they're only starting points, not ending points. They start something that affects Christians, that affects humans right now. And the clearest one for me is the 4th, secularism. Secularism is really clear for us now. However, what about apostasy?